Hi, I'm Julianne Cost. In the next few minutes, we're going to take a look at several of the different masking tools in Lightroom Classic. To access the different masking tools, we can click on the mask icon, or we can use the keyboard shortcut Shift+W. There are several different types of masks. Subject, sky, background, objects, and people are all based on artificial intelligence and machine learning. There's also manual masks, such as the brush, the linear, and the radial gradients. And there are 3 different range masks: the color, luminance, and depth range. We're going to start by selecting the brush, or we could tap the K key to select it. As soon as we do that, the masking panel appears. We can reposition the panel by dragging it in the preview area or to a secondary monitor, or we can dock it at the top of the adjustment stack. For now, I'll go ahead and dock it in the upper right of the image. If we click on the question mark, we can see the shortcuts for masking. I can click on the double arrows in order to collapse, click them again in order to expand the masks panel. All right, let's take a look at the different brush options. If they're not showing, you can use the disclosure triangle in order to view them. We can use the sliders to change the size of the brush, as well as the feather, which will change the edge softness. There's also the flow slider, which sets the speed at which the brush applies the adjustment, as well as the density slider, which will cap the amount of the adjustment that can be applied. We can also use the left bracket key to get a smaller brush or the right bracket key to get a larger brush, and if we add the shift key, we can either decrease or increase the feather amount. I can use the numeric keys to set the flow amount. If I tap 5, I'll get 50%, 6 will give me 60%. If you type quickly, like 7, 8, you can get a more precise amount. For now, I'll tap 0 to set the flow to 100%. I want to darken down the rocks in the upper left, so I'm going to start painting over them. As soon as I start painting, Lightroom Classic displays a red overlay. If we want to change the color of the overlay, we can click in the color swatch, and then choose any color, or select from the default colors. We can also change the opacity and whether or not the overlaid area shows the affected or the unaffected areas. There are also a number of overlays that we'll discuss in just a moment. For now, I'm going to set it back to red, and then in the tone panel, I'm going to decrease the exposure in that area. As soon as I move the slider, Lightroom Classic will hide that red overlay. To see the overlay again, we can either tap the O key or we can enable Show Overlay. If I position my cursor over the image area, we can see a pin in the image, and when I hover my cursor on top of it, that will also display the overlay for that pin. All right, let me move my cursor away, and I'm going to switch to the eraser tool and then show the overlay. If I want to remove an area, we can see that the eraser tool has different settings. So I'll just increase the size a bit using the bracket keys, and then paint here in order to remove my adjustment from this area. All right, let's switch back to brush A. And if you don't want to switch back and forth between the brush and the eraser, we can simply hold down the Option key or the Alt key on Windows in order to toggle between the two. All right, let's tap the O key again to hide the overlay. If we want to prevent the masks panel from toggling between showing and hiding the panel every time we paint in the image, we can click the More icon and disable the Auto Hide Masking panel. Also, after making adjustments to a slider, like we did with the exposure slider in the tone group, the eye for that icon turns light gray. This makes it easy to quickly know if settings from a specific group of adjustments have been applied to a mask. We can click and hold on the eye icon to preview the visibility of the adjustments in that section. I also find it helpful to right-click on any of the group's names and choose Solo Mode. In Solo Mode, clicking on a group header expands the contents of that group while collapsing any other open group, eliminating the need to scroll through several open groups in order to access different options. If I scroll down, we can also see that we can access the Global Adjustments panel, which can be helpful for making adjustments to our images without having to leave the masking tools. All right, let's reposition the Masks panel a little bit lower because I want to make adjustments right up here. I want to darken this down, but not as much as the area on the left. So I'm going to tap the 4 key, which will set the flow to 40%. I'll get a little bit smaller of a brush. And then as I paint in this area, I can slowly build up the amount of the adjustment. All right, let's toggle the visibility of this mask. So there's before and there's after. All right, let's go ahead and dock the Masks panel again. Now, if we want to view different overlay modes, we can either click on the color swatch again, or we can click on the More icon and then select them from the list. They also appear down here in the toolbar. One of the overlays that I find helpful is this white on black. I'll tap the O key in order to view that, and where the mask is white, we can see the adjustments. As the shades of gray in the mask get darker, then the adjustments become less and less visible until the mask is completely black, where we can't see the adjustments at all. If we want to cycle through the overlay modes, we can hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows, and then tap the O key in order to cycle through them. All right, let's set that back to the color overlay. And to cycle through the default color overlays, I can hold down the Shift key and then tap the O key. All right, let's hide the overlay for now. And I have 3 additional tips for the brush tool. If you have very different sets of options that you often toggle between, say like a large soft edge brush and a small harder edge brush, you can set up 2 different brushes. The / key will toggle between brush A and brush B. The brush also has an invert option. We can enable it here, or we can tap the apostrophe key in order to toggle the invert option. Tapping the A key will toggle on or off the Auto Mask option. Auto Mask detects edges based on contrast and color to help apply adjustments to a selective area. To rename the mask, we can simply double-click on it and then enter something more specific to the image. To toggle the visibility of a mask, we can click on the eye icon to the right of the mask. All right, let's add a second mask by clicking on the plus icon. And I'll select the brush again because I want to darken down the foreground. I'll tap A to toggle off Auto Mask and tap 0 to put the flow back at 100. I'll get a little bit larger of a brush with a very large feather. As I set down the paint, we can see that red overlay again. Now, each time that we add a new mask, all of the adjustments are going to be reset. If you want to change that behavior, you can uncheck the Reset Sliders Automatically option, but I'm going to leave it enabled. Then I'm going to decrease the exposure a little, and I'll move to Effects, and I'll increase the dehaze amount, which adds a little bit too much saturation, so I'll use the color options to desaturate that foreground area. If you've changed several sliders to create your adjustment like we just did here, and you feel that the adjustment is either a little bit too much or a little bit too little, you can use the amount slider to either decrease the amount of the adjustment or amplify the adjustment. All right, let's click the plus icon and add one more brush mask. I'll get a bit smaller of a brush and start painting in this area to darken it down. I'll use the tone group to decrease the exposure, as well as take down the highlights and the whites. I'm going to cool that down a bit by moving the temperature slider a little bit to the left, as well as the tint slider, and then I'll reduce the amount slider. If we need to reposition a mask at any time, we can click on the pin for the mask and then reposition it in the image area. Clicking on another pin will automatically select that mask in the mask panel, which is especially helpful if you haven't named your masks. If you find that the pins are too distracting, you can either change when the pins are displayed using the toolbar, or you can use the More icon to set those same options, as well as choose whether or not to show unselected mask pins. All right, let's move to this next image of the fallen birch tree. On this image, I want to use the linear gradient in order to lighten the left side of the image. I'll click and drag out to the right, and everywhere to the left of this first white line is going to be adjusted. Then the adjustment will become less and less visible until we reach the right line, and to the right of this line, we won't see any of the adjustments at all. If I need to reposition the gradient, I can drag the pin. We can change the length of the gradient by dragging either one of the two outer lines. If we need to rotate it, I can drag the handle, or I can position my cursor over the center line, and when I see the double-headed arrows, I can drag in order to rotate. If we want to invert it, we can use that same shortcut, the apostrophe, or we can use the invert option. All right, let's just increase the exposure a bit. I'm also going to bring up the shadows, move to the color group, and increase the temperature to make it a little bit warmer. But what if we don't want the linear gradient to affect the birch tree? Well, we can add a secondary component to the mask. To remove the adjustment from the tree, I'll click on the mask and choose Subtract. I'll select the brush, and then we can paint over the area that we don't want to be affected. Now, if I position my cursor on top of the linear gradient, we can see the overlay of that mask component. And when I position my cursor over the thumbnail of the brush, we can see the overlay of that component. When I position my cursor over the thumbnail for the mask, we see the result of the brush being subtracted from the linear gradient. I'll tap O to keep the overlay on, and then just subtract this area as well. I want this branch to also be removed, so let's just paint right up here as well. Then I'll tap O to toggle off the overlay. A huge advantage of creating a mask from multiple components is that we can adjust the components independent of one another. So if I need to move the linear gradient, I can drag that anywhere in the image, and it doesn't affect the brush component at all. Likewise, if I select the brush component and I reposition that, it's not going to affect the linear gradient. If I wanted to reposition all of the components in a mask at one time, I can click on the mask icon and then select any of the pins in order to move them all together. All right, let's go ahead and undo that. If I wanted to delete a single mask component, I can click on the More icon and choose to delete that component. If I want to delete the entire mask, I can select the mask and either tap the Delete key or use the More icon to delete the mask or delete all masks. All right, in this next image of the dune, I want to add a radial gradient to darken down the edges. I'll choose the radial gradient, and we can click and drag out a radial gradient from anywhere in the image. Notice that it drags out from the center. If you want it to drag out from the corner, you can hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows. We can use the middle dot in order to reposition the radial gradient, or the white dots on the outer portion of the circle in order to change the shape. And we can use this handle in order to rotate it, or we can position a cursor anywhere along the outer white line, and when we see the double-headed arrows, we can click and drag to rotate it that way as well. We can also drag this red dot. If I drag it inwards, we're going to get a larger feather value. If I drag it outwards, we're going to get a lower feather value, which will give us a more abrupt transition between the areas that are being changed and those that are not. We can also use the feather slider if we prefer. But notice that the red overlay is in the center of the gradient. So when I make a change to exposure, the change is going to happen inside of the radial gradient. To invert the radial gradient so that the exposure affects the outside of the circle, we can tap the apostrophe or click Invert. I'm also going to use the color adjustments in order to add a little bit more blue and then just reposition this a bit. I like the overall effect, but if we toggle the visibility of the mask, we can see that we've lost some of the yellow in the foreground and it's darkened it down more than I would like it to. So with this mask targeted, I'll choose Subtract, select the linear gradient, and drag from the lower left up into the image to subtract that area. It looks better, but now the bottom corner is too bright. So I'll choose Add, select the brush, I'll tap the 3 key to decrease the flow, and get a large brush, and then just paint to add back in this area. So now we've started with our radial gradient, and then subtracted using the linear gradient, and then just added back in a little bit using the brush. Let's toggle the visibility, so there's before, and there's after. All right, moving to this next image. On the masking panel, I'll select Subject, and Lightroom Classic will use AI to create a mask of the pears. I'll change the color temperature in order to make them look a little bit more ripe. If I wanted a mask of everything except for the subject, we could select the background mask, or since we already have this subject mask made, I could use the More icon and choose to duplicate and invert this mask. Now I don't really need that, so with it targeted, I'll tap the Delete key. Now to select only one of the pears, I'll click the plus icon and choose Objects. We can choose between using the brush mode to make a loose paint stroke over the subject, or we can use the rectangular selection mode and then drag out a marquee around the subject. When I release the cursor, Lightroom Classic shrinks the rectangle and selects that pear. Then I'll use the hue slider in order to add a little bit more orange and red tones to the pear. But I want to remove that warmer hue from the bottom of the pear, so I'll target the mask, choose Subtract, select my brush, get a little bit smaller of a brush, set the flow to 100 by tapping the 0 key, and then paint in order to remove that color in this area. So we have the mask for the object, subtracting the mask for the brush, resulting in our composite mask. All right, I'll add another Objects mask. This time I'll drag out over the napkin, and then I'll remove a little bit of saturation to get rid of the blue tint, move to Tone, and then take down the highlights a bit. Now to add a ray of light to the background, I'll want to add another mask and select Brush. I want the ray to start relatively small, so I'll select a brush about this size and I'll click. Then I'll hold down the Shift key, get a larger brush, and then click again in the lower right. Lightroom Classic will connect those two paint strokes and interpolate the size of the brush between them. Then I can choose to increase my exposure so we get a nice ray of light. But we can also see the light on the pear in the foreground. So with Mask 4, I'm going to subtract and choose Subject. But it's still affecting this wooden area, so I'll choose Subtract again, select the brush, get a small brush, and then just paint here in order to remove it. I can get a little bit larger of a brush, and then if I need to reposition that brush, I can click on the pin and then just drag it down a bit. Excellent. In this next image of the iceberg, I want to shift the color temperature of the sky. So I'll select the Sky mask, and AI will generate a mask for the sky. Then I'll move the temperature slider to the right, as well as the tint slider. I think that looks good with the reflection in the water. So to add some color contrast between the sky and the iceberg, I'll add another mask, choose Select Subject, and then move the temperature and the tint slider in the opposite direction. I think I'll also just desaturate that a wee bit. All right, for those of you who work with portraits, Lightroom Classic can automatically detect people in an image. When it does, we'll see an icon for each of the people that it detects in the mask panel. Clicking on the person will then display additional mask options. We can make a mask for the entire person, or we can create individual masks or combinations of different masks. I'm going to select all of these and then create 8 separate masks. There are additional items that Lightroom Classic can detect, like facial hair, like beards and mustaches. All right, let's walk through these AI masks. For the face skin, I'm going to use the effects and just move the texture slider a little bit to the left to soften the skin. I'll go to mask 2, which is the body skin. That's everything that's not the face skin. I'll move the texture down to the left as well, and then go to tone and also decrease the exposure, which will place more emphasis on the face. The third mask are the eyebrows. We could make adjustments to that, or if you don't need one of the masks, you can just tap the delete key. All right, let's zoom in a bit for these next masks. Mask 4 is going to be the eye sclera. That's the whites of the eyes, so we can move the exposure up just a little bit. Mask 5 is the iris and the pupil. I'm going to use the effects panel and add a little bit of dehaze, which will take the darker values darker, and then use the tone curve to just brighten up the exposure a little bit, adding some contrast to the eyes and making it look like I've gotten a better night's sleep. Mask 6 is going to be the lips. Let's just take the exposure down there a little bit and go to color and just change the tint. Now, mask 7 is the hair mask, so let's zoom out a bit. I'm just going to remove a little bit of saturation and then make it a little bit brighter. But I think some areas are getting too bright, so even though this is an AI mask, we can still add additional components. I'll choose Subtract, select the brush, tap the 3 key to get 30%, and then just subtract this area here and over here. And the last mask here is going to be the clothing. I'll use the curve in order to lighten the brighter areas and then maybe just darken down the jacket. Now by default, the curve changes luminance and saturation. And in this image, I don't mind if the blues become more saturated. But in other images, we might need to decrease the refine saturation slider to lessen or remove the changes made to saturation. All right, on the mask panel, let's click and hold on the eye. So there's before and there's after. All right, moving on to range masking, I want to demonstrate 2 ways to use color range masking. When I select the color range mask and I position my cursor over the image area, I automatically get an eyedropper. I can click to select a color. I can add the Shift key in order to add up to 5 additional points to my selection, or we can click and drag in order to select a color range. We can then use the Refine slider in order to refine the color range. Moving it to the left will tighten the color range so fewer colors are added. Moving it to the right will expand the color range. Now, this might seem similar to using point color, but the color that I select here will become the mask. Whereas with point color, you would first create the mask and then use the point color tool to make adjustments within that mask. Now, when we make an adjustment with the hue slider, we can see that all of the reds are being changed in the entire image. This is also very similar to using the color mixer and point color, but notice that with color range, we can change the hue all the way around the color wheel. Now, if we want to restrict the adjustments so that they only affect a portion of the image, we can choose Subtract and then select the brush. I'll decrease the feather amount, get a little bit larger of a brush, and then tap 0 in order to increase the flow to 100%, and then paint the hue shift out of this area. Now let's hide this mask for a moment. Another way to use the tool is to start by adding a brush. I'll just paint loosely over the red area in the sign because that's what I want to affect. But we can see that when I change the hue, it changes the hue of everywhere that I painted. To limit the change to only the reds, I want to add a color range mask, but I can't use add and I can't use subtract. Instead, we want the intersection of the brush and the color range. So I can either use the More icon and choose Intersect Mask With and then select Color Range, or we can hold down the Option or the Alt key and the Add and Subtract will change to Intersect. I'll select that and then Color Range and then use the eyedropper to click and drag over the reds in the sign. So now the hue is only affecting where my original brush stroke and the reds that I picked up with color range intersect. It looks like I didn't quite get enough here, so I'll select my brush, paint down here, and we can always return to color range and refine the range that's selected, including more values of red that are under here in the shadow of the sign. Excellent. Let's take a look at luminance range masking. We can use this to target areas in an image based on their brightness values. But before we make any changes, I'm going to return to the Edit stack and let's zoom in. As I increase the shadows, the amount of noise in that shadow area becomes more pronounced. It's subtle, so I'm hoping you can see this after the video is compressed and uploaded. I want to decrease the amount of noise, but just in the shadow areas. So I'll return to masking, choose the luminance range, and use the eyedropper to click in the darker values. Now we can use the luminance range ramp in order to refine those values. The rectangle represents the range of values that will be changed. We can reposition the rectangle, as well as make the rectangle larger to include more values or smaller. The distance between the rectangle and this line is the fade range. So the larger I make this distance, the softer the transition between the areas that are adjusted and those are not. All right, under the Details panel, I'm going to increase the noise reduction in order to remove the noise from the shadow areas. After we make an adjustment, if we want to see what values are being adjusted, we can either show the overlay or show the luminance map. Or I can leave this disabled and then Option or Alt drag in the ramp in order to change and view the luminance map. All right, let's add a secondary luminance range mask. This time I want to target the highlight area in the polar bear's fur. Then I'm going to decrease the highlights as well as increase the texture. And let's just drag that fade range a little bit further to the left. I'll toggle on the eye icon, so there's before and there's after, but I only want the brighter values in the bear to be affected. So I'll zoom out, hold down the Option or Alt key so that I can select Intersect, choose Objects, and then drag the rectangle around the bear. So now we can see there's the luminance range that's selected, but I'm limiting it to only those bright values that are in the bear, and here's our resulting mask. So here's before, and there's after. All right, moving to this image. The last range masking is the depth range, and this option selects areas in an image based on their distance from the camera, and it can be used with any photo that has embedded depth map data. So currently that's limited to HEIC files captured on Apple iPhones using portrait mode. I'll choose range and then depth range, and I'll use the eyedropper to click in the foreground area. Then I'll desaturate that area, and above we can see a visual representation of areas in the image based on their distance from the camera. So the left side is the foreground, and as I move the rectangle over to the right, now the areas that were furthest from the camera are desaturated. All right, let's drag out the fade range in order to make that a gentle transition, and we can also change the size of the rectangle. To move them together, just click in between them and then drag. We can enable Show Depth Map to preview the depth map. The dark red areas are being affected, whereas the white areas are not. Or we can leave this disabled and then hold Option on Mac or Alt on Windows and drag any of these sliders in order to preview it. Excellent. Before we wrap up, I want to talk about 4 ways to quickly automate the masking tools. I want to start with the previous command with this image selected. After retouching one image, if I want to move to another image and apply all of the effects from the previous selected image, well, I could select that image and then choose Previous. Lightroom Classic would re-render all of those AI masks and apply them to this new image. Let's use Command-Z or Control-Z to undo that. If we want more control over the settings that are applied, I'll return to the retouched image and choose Copy. Let's imagine that we've made different global adjustments to each of our image. So now we only want to copy the masking. So I'll enable masking, choose Copy, move to the next image, and then select Paste. And again, all of the AI masks will automatically be re-rendered and applied. Now, if you include any manual masks when you choose Paste, and the subject has moved, then the manual masks might need to be repositioned, or if the image is really different, they might need to be recreated. For example, here, where we have the brush added to the hair mask, I might want to hover my cursor on top of it and then drag down that pin so that it better aligns with this image. Now, the third way would be to enable auto sync. I'll select both of these portraits, flip on the switch to auto sync, create a new select background mask, and then increase the exposure for the background. We can see that it's been updated on both of the images. All right, let's turn off auto sync. And finally, presets. They're an amazing way to store settings so that they can be applied to additional images. If we include an AI mask in one of these presets, then what we'll be creating is an adaptive preset. We can see several different groups of adaptive presets, including portrait, as well as sky and subject. When I hover my cursor over the presets, we can see some of the different effects that they create. Now, to create our own preset, I'll choose to add a sky mask. I'll take down the exposure, move to color and decrease the saturation, and then use the effects to add a little bit of clarity as well as dehaze. Then I'll double-click on the mask in order to call this Sky Mask. And then from the Presets panel, we can click on the plus icon, choose Create Preset, give the preset a name, save it in a group, enable the Sky Mask, and I'll keep the option to support the amount slider enabled so that when I create the preset and I move to another image and I apply that Sky Mask, I can then use the amount slider in order to decrease or increase the effect of my preset. All right, one last tip. You may have noticed a little dot appears under each tool in the Develop module to indicate which tools have settings that have changed. If there is a red dot under the masking icon, it means that there are AI masks that need to be updated. This is most likely because one of the healing tools was used to make a change in an area in the image after an AI mask was applied. For example, this image has a sky mask applied. If we select the healing brush and choose one of the tools, and then we click in the image in an area that intersects with the AI mask, then you'll need to recalculate it. Simply selecting the mask, and then choosing to update the AI masks will take care of the problem. I'm Julianne Cost. Thanks for watching.